Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the third event in the Institute for Government's Labour Fringe programme. Tech for All, Tech for Good. How can government ensure digital transformation works for everyone? Kindly supported by the Solicitors Regulation Authority. I'm Gavin Freeguard, Programme Director for Data and Digital Government at the IFG, and it's wonderful to welcome so many of you virtually to the Virtual Institute. Some virtual housekeeping before we get underway. We are on the record. We'll be live tweeting from @IFG events, and you can get involved with hashtag IFGLab2020 and also with the main Labour conference hashtag, which is simply Lab2020. Most importantly, you can submit questions for me to put to our panel using the live Q&A tool in this broadcast. There should be a button which is a speech bubble with a question mark in it somewhere on your screen. Please do ask questions throughout the event, especially since one of our speakers has to leave a little bit early, and do tell us who you are and where you're joining us from. Our sponsors for this event are the Solicitors Regulation Authority, the regulator of solicitors and law firms in England and Wales, protecting consumers and supporting the rule of law. Remember that, and the administration of justice. The SRA regulates more than 200,000 solicitors and 10,000 law firms, overseeing the education and training requirements necessary to practice as a solicitor, licensing individuals and firms to practice, and setting, regulating and enforcing compliance against the standards of the profession. So, tech for all, tech for good. How can government ensure digital transformation works for everyone? It seems almost trite to say that the coronavirus crisis has transformed our relationship with technology and brought issues about the use of tech to the fore. Whether it's socialising with our friends, doing our jobs and doing business, accessing services from government and others, including legal services, even attending party conference events, we are living our lives online like never before. Or at least many of us are. Not everyone has access to those opportunities. Not everyone can live and work online in that way. And the A-level fiasco has provided a world-beating example of how algorithmic bias can entrench existing inequalities. So how can we make sure that the digitally excluded are not left behind and that technology does not bake in existing societal and social biases? How can government and regulators guide digital transformation in a responsible way? We've got a fantastic panel to answer those questions and more for you this afternoon. First, we'll be hearing from Onwurah, the Member of Parliament for Newcastle upon Tyne Central since 2010 and Shadow Minister for Science, Research and Digital, shadowing both the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy and the Department for Digital, Culture, Media and Sport. She is often known as the only engineer in Parliament. After working in a variety of roles for companies around the world, she was head of telecoms technology for communications regulator Ofcom before entering Parliament. After Chi, we'll hear from Tracy Vegro. Tracy has been the Executive Director for Strategy and Innovation at the Solicitors Regulation Authority since March 2020, where she leads the development of the SRA's work on technology and innovation. She has wide experience of regulation, strategy and policy, having held senior roles at the Financial Reporting Council and in the civil service, mainly at the Department for Business, before joining the SRA. Then we'll hear from Ivana Bartoletti, who works, writes and speaks widely on privacy and digital ethics, working with companies in the UK and globally. In May 2018, she launched the Women Leading in AI Network, an international lobby group of women advocating for responsible artificial intelligence. Earlier this year, she published her first book, An Artificial Revolution on Power, Politics and AI. She's also chair of the Executive Committee of the Fabian Society. Last but not least, we'll hear from Naureen, Chief of Staff to the CEO of Accenture's government practice. She's previously held senior roles at Computer Centre and Tech UK, having started her career in the field of equality and human rights. She's the chair of Tech UK's Central Government Council, which represents the views of tech companies to government, and a trustee of the Good Things Foundation, a charity focused on digital inclusion. We really couldn't ask for a more qualified panel for today's event. I'll invite each of our speakers to make an opening contribution of up to 5 minutes. Then we'll go into questions, some from me and lots, I hope, from you. Please do use that Q&A tool to submit them throughout the event. Chi has to leave us at 1:15, so I'll go to her for any final thoughts just before that. Then we'll have another 15 minutes or so with the rest of our panel, concluding at around 1:30. So without any further ado, Chi, over to you.
Thank you so much, Gavin, and thanks for that fantastic introduction. And I'd also really like to thank the Institute for Government for organising this event, inviting me, and the Solicitors Regulation Authority for making it possible, because this is a topic which is very dear to my heart. So as a chartered engineer, as Gavin mentioned, I built out the networks that became the internet all over the world, in Europe, US, Nigeria, and Asia. And as a politician, you know, the internet, tech, data, digital government, but most importantly, making technology empowerment for the many, not the few, has been sort of central to the campaigns that and the shadow positions that I've taken. And in some ways, I'm pleased, you know, that this has now got greater awareness, even though it is because of the terrible pandemic that has happened. But the coronavirus has shifted many of our services and much of our professional and personal lives online. And as we move, as we are in the COVID digital era, with panel events are hosted on Teams and exam results decided by misused algorithms, and even questions in Parliament being asked via video link, who would have thought it? Digital regulation for the benefit of us all takes on an even greater significance. And that's one of the things I'm concerned about, is the recent move of the government recently moved the responsibility for the use of data from the Department for Digital Culture, Media and Sport to the Cabinet Office. When they'd moved it only 2 years ago, they'd moved it in the other direction in order to try to have a more coherent approach to data. And for those of us who believe in the incredible power of data and technology to improve everyone's lives and to improve public services, you know, it throws up some fundamentally profound questions about the directions that we are moving in under the kind of Whitehall power grab of Dominic Cummings. So the pandemic should be making us all think about what digital governance should look like. Local councils being denied localised data has been a source of real frustration for hard-pressed local authority public health teams. And imagine how much different things could have been over these last few months if those closest to the people at risk and in need were actually equipped with the data from across different agencies and services to service that need. But partially because we did not have a coherent regulatory framework for data in the public or private sector, that took months and months to happen. So we needed an approach to digital that embraces the unique role of the public sector in treating people as citizens rather than just consumers. And I am tired of hearing that the public sector just has to copy what the private sector is doing. Yeah, government is not Facebook, thank God. And it also needs to be dedicated to long-term inclusion as well as short-term targets. And it's, I think, true also that we have squandered a lead that we had in this area with the government digital services, you know, which is conceived under Labour and brought into being under the Conservative and coalition government, which was truly kind of ahead of its time and had resulted in some really great online services such as, you know, DVLA, choosing your pension, checking your pension contributions as well. But again, because we didn't have a coherent framework, a robust regulatory framework for data control and ownership, we have, you know, that has not been consistently followed through even across central government, never mind across local authorities, local government. So I think it's really important that citizens as well as startups, you know, and legislators as well as developers, we understand that technology, you know, pandemic has focused us on this, but technology is constantly changing our lives, and it will be even more in the future. And the opportunities and challenges that these changes bring is something that government needs to look forward to and set out the right regulatory frameworks for. And one of the things which really saddens me is it's 7 years since I launched Labour's Digital Government Review, which focused on how we put citizens in control of increasingly digital public services, including data and information usage, particularly in the areas of value creation, consent, trust and privacy. It was a 6-month-long review, came forward with a report. Unfortunately, I was looking at the report recently again, everything there is still relevant because successive governments have failed to address these areas. successive Conservative governments, it's important that we get the principles right rather than just getting all excited, you know, about the latest technology, blockchain or whatever catches Boris Johnson's eye. We need to have a deep dive into what the issues are and establish principles, and that's why, you know, Labour have now, just this month or last month, August, launched our digital future consultation, and I'll put the link in the chat. You know, it's really, we look forward to contributions from everyone. We just have that debate and discussion and establish principles. And some reason, though, we obviously I have quite strong views on what those principles should be around shared, you know, digital rights and public trust. But the important thing is to have the debate and to have the principles, and so that we have some kind of, you know, regulatory, not certainty, but understanding. And to make the most of digital transformation, we have to ensure public trust. Just absolutely key. And I'm afraid we've already, before COVID, there was talk of the tech lash. And unfortunately, I would say COVID has not increased, and we see this in the level of disinformation and misinformation, again, which the government is not addressing, has not increased the public's trust in technology or public services. Labour has been absolutely clear that we need a digital bill of rights and a legal duty of care to give more powers and protections back to consumers, with new rules to protect our democracy from subversion online. We've seen successive governments, it's absolutely essential to build public trust by having an open debate, and taking back control mustn't mean a Downing Street data grab. Public data must be a public good. And we must discover how government can best use technology to work for the public good. And, you know, Gavin, you talked about the digital exclusion, and that 10% of people who aren't online, who are excluded. There are more who are excluded from a lack of skills and a lack of understanding and a lack of access to digital training. And that is something that we need to ensure that people can retrain. And our Shadow Chancellor is talking today about that. But we want to ensure that people can retrain to have the skills for the digital era, for the fourth industrial revolution, and so that we have public services which are tailored to people, using people's data in a way which is controlled by people. As data becomes, you know, is one of the most sought after commodities driving new business models, it's essential that citizens feel that they are in control of it. And just one of the reasons why I am not using a background, as some of the other speakers I see are, is we just saw over the weekend there's been debate online about the not Microsoft Teams, but the Zoom algorithm for enabling backgrounds, and how it is biased towards those with white skin, as opposed to rather than those with darker skin, in terms of enabling it. And so the algorithm, you know, and again over the summer we saw the consequences of algorithms being used in the public sector in a way which I felt was a basic misuse. But we need to have I've asked a number of times for a register of algorithms which are being used by government, and I've been told that it's up to every department, it's not necessary, algorithms are just, you know, processes. These are tools of incredible power, and until we show that we believe that power needs to be accountable, I'm afraid we are just waiting for the next scandal to happen. So COVID-19 could be a point of inflection for the advancement of digital governance. We will be seeing the online harms bill, hopefully, which is long awaited from government soon. I hope that they will see from the impact of the pandemic the need to set out robust regulatory framework to protect our rights, take advantage of technology advancements for all in both the public and the private domain. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Shea. Huge amount of ground there, everything from misinformation to algorithms to digital exclusion. Lots of topics for people to ask questions about, so please do use the Q&A tool on your screen. Next, I'll hand over to Tracy.
Well, thank you, Gavin, and thank you, Chief, for that amazing introduction. I just want to say, first of all, thank you very much for putting this topic out there for a discussion today, because I absolutely think it's critical and crucial. Where I'm speaking from, the Solicitors Regulation Authority, it's vital for us. People know and talk quite a lot about fintech, perhaps less so about the law tech, and we're conscious that all the things Chief's just outlined are very important for us. How do you use tech in the public interest? How do we as a regulator think about how we stimulate innovation and the uptake of law tech by us being mindful of protecting the citizen, the consumer? People don't talk enough about the consumer in relation to digital services. And how are we making sure that those we regulate, the regulated community of solicitors, are acting in ways that are ethical, that things like the algorithms that may or may not apply in the sector are meeting the standards that people would expect. So it's exciting times. I completely agree that the COVID pandemic, sad though it has been for so many aspects of our life, probably has stimulated innovation at a faster pace in some ways. And that, for us, has thrown up some very interesting issues around how do we as a regulator make clear what is and isn't acceptable? How are we working with the sector early enough to avoid something happening that's then a problem, whilst also stimulating and directing and helping as things develop? Everybody knows there's a digital divide. I'm always reminding people there's also an access to justice issue in the UK. Many citizens are not able, wouldn't even begin to think about how they could access legal advice. And so for us, the two go together. If we can do more to ensure that access to justice can be enabled and helped by innovation and technology, that's a good thing. Again, mindful that there may be a double whammy if the people who are still not accessing tech are not the ones accessing justice either. That's never a position we would want to be in. So we want to think of ourselves at the forefront of regulation. The issues that are very much on our list are about what kind of access is good access. We run something called the Legal Access Challenge, and I don't know if you noticed, but a couple of the winners were very interesting. One was in the field of domestic abuse, which again has sadly increased during the COVID lockdown. And it was about a means of accessing help through an app. So instead of struggling with the very immediate impact that domestic violence can have, you had a means to get help locally very quickly through an app on your phone. We were very proud that that was one of our winners, and equally proud that the other one was an association with MenCap about accessing mental health need. Again, very important, brought in to start relief during the COVID pandemic, just how much people wrestle with that and how little advice there is available and how patchy that can be across the country. So we've got some very live examples of how technology and innovation is helping. We see as a public sector body, as a regulator, as someone who's here in the public interest, we have to be mindful of embracing tech, but very much appropriately and to protect people as well. So I wanted to just flag very quickly, because I know we're going to run out of time. It's a fantastic programme. Just some of the things that we're looking at as to do next. So we are very mindful that we want to get our SRA Innovate space really working ever harder for people. The idea of sandboxes, the idea of brokering tech investors and tech providers, new ideas, harnessing, giving a sort of an early sort of judgment of how we as a regulator might or might not be able to approve something, trying to get involved at the early stages of tech, trying to learn from other sectors of professional services, trying to look very taken with what she said about government digital. You know, how do we all as citizens know digital is working for us in relation to public services, and shouldn't government actually be talking to more bodies like regulators and ensuring we're getting getting it right first time rather than having a problem, sadly, like the one we saw with Ofqual. There's no good blame gaming people, is there? We should never get in a position where people can't be absolutely certain that something like that has been tested to destruction. We also want to really understand the difference between young and old. We did an event with Age Concern, and actually I was very reassured that many people have got access to kit, and an iPad's been transformational for many people in how they've operated. But equally, it comes down to sometimes people do not have the ability. When 7 people are homeschooling on a mobile phone, that's simply not good enough. So it's about making sure people have got the tools, not just the skill set. And I think we've often talked about one or the other. And again, from a government policy perspective, and for us as regulators, we need to make sure we're dealing with all of those things in parallel. You don't want to solve one problem to only have a bigger problem elsewhere. We're very mindful of that as a regulator. And, you know, I want to see the profession. Many people say law is quite a traditional profession. It's certainly, we've not seen law tech take off at quite the pace that fintech did. Why is that? What are the barriers? Is there anything we as a regulator should be doing? What more signals could we be making? Could I be working more closely with the likes of Government Digital Service? How do you get to work with that kind of service? You know, it doesn't seem very welcoming of bigger national solutions. My background is as a Department of Business civil servant, and I still don't see the Department of Business necessarily doing as much as they could either in this sphere. I think government needs to join up its digital and innovation approach, because I think they really do go together. So they were some of the thoughts I wanted to kick off. I'm really looking forward to questions and delighted to be part of such a great panel. So thank you for that.
Tracy, thank you very much indeed. And Tracy said she's looking forward to questions. Please do submit them via the Q&A tool, and I will put them to the panel later. Next, I'm handing over to Ivana.
Thank you so much for this and for the opportunity to share some of my thoughts around particularly interesting times that we're going through from a sort of tech policy perspective. So I just want to make some sort of very short remarks, and then I hope that in the discussion some of them will be picked up and we can discuss it further. So the first thing that I wanted to say, that I just wanted to start with what we've realised, I think, as citizens in the COVID time. I think there's one thing that sort of really emerged in during this pandemic is really emerging, is how interconnected we all are as citizens, and how there is nothing more valuable from a citizen's perspective, from a public perspective, than the value of personal data. And to an extent, I go even further, but there is nothing more public. There's nothing more than the value of some very personal information, and that is because this pandemic has really shown us how interconnected we are. And if I have COVID and the other person doesn't know, then I could pass it on to them. But at the same time, during all this, when we've realised the interconnection, we've also realised that people are lacking trust at the moment. When we've had all the discussions around the contact tracing app, interestingly so, we've been I would say, you know, what worried me a little bit about that time was that we were listening more to cryptographers than to the epidemiologists. And to an extent, you know, what we've been through is this: people have witnessed the Cambridge Analytica. They know that if research data can become data for online manipulation, then why not? Why can't COVID data today become manipulation data or advertising data tomorrow? That element of trust that we've been discussing a lot over the last few months, and that she so brilliantly talked about, is crucial, because we need trust. You know, we really need that trust, and we have a sort of crossroads at the moment, because technology is really progressing at rapid speed in both public and private sector. And this is happening because obviously COVID has accelerated all this, with sadly not too many checks and controls at the moment. And we are building on the trends that we had and we were witnessing way before COVID. And the trends that we're building on are the trends of surveillance and the trends of datafication. And those are the trends that have been underpinning the digital ecosystem for quite a long time. And therefore, we're building on this at the time where we are speeding up this innovation. And I am a huge fan of technology. You know, I love it so much that I want it to really work for everybody. And I'm really pretty aware, like we all are, that the digital dividends have not been distributed fairly over the last decades. So the key thing is, my views is that sort of the trust that we need to build is the fact that we're building on the data, on the trends that we had seen before. So the surveillance trends, the datafication tests, everything had to sort of turn into data with what somebody's calls, you know, the techno-chauvinism, the idea that something does digitally from a technical standpoint has to be necessarily better. The key thing, in my view, is how we move forward now. I think 2020 has been the year where the general public has woken up to the issue of the politics of data. And this is happening because of different reasons. As I mentioned, COVID and the fact that people have realized how interconnected we all are. And the second thing is the A-level fiasco that we mentioned, where people have realized that data is nothing but neutral. That data is not neutral. Data is a picture of society as it is, and therefore represents entrenched inequalities and the sort of digital structure, the social structures of our society. But also people have realized, in my view, something else. And this is probably because of the Black Lives Matter movement in the US and across the world. People have realized that we can have the perfect algorithm, but that doesn't mean that we need to use it. We can have the perfect technology, and that doesn't mean that we need to use it. And a clear example, in my view, of all this is around surveillance and facial recognition. You know, one of the criticisms that people make of facial recognition is they say it's biased. It doesn't work with black faces. Yes, but even if we created a perfect algorithm that works and recognizes everybody perfectly, would we still want to be watched? Would we still want to be surveilled? And also, aren't we sure that the use of that technology itself wouldn't be biased? Aren't we sure that that technology could be used to wrap surveillance around segments of societies and more vulnerable people? Why am I saying this? Because I think people are waking up to two things. First is that algorithms can replicate bias, and technology can really automate and scale up the inequalities that we have in societies, and that for many different reasons, including because data is not neutral at all. But we've also realized something else, and that is that technology in itself is not can be used for the wrong thing, even if it's built in the most perfect way. And the way I always say this is a technological fix is not going to be enough. What we need to discuss is as a society, and the agreement that we need to have is, what are we going to use technology for? What are we trying to achieve? When we say technology for the common good, you know, what we need to look is not just how the technology is built, but what technology we're going to build in the first place. And that leads me to the last point I want to make, which is around the regulation. Now, I think when it comes to regulating this world, it's not an easy task. And I feel a little bit uncomfortable when people say we've got to regulate. Hold on a moment. We don't want to rush it. I think there is a key issue around, first of all, does current legislation work? Is that enough? Is anti-discrimination law enough for discrimination caused by algorithms? Legislation that we've got at the moment in terms of liability, does it suffice? Can it cope with the age of algorithms? The privacy legislation, is that enough? The issue, for example, of data which is inferred about individuals, the really narrow gap and the blurred line between what is private data and personal data, but what is special categories of data, you know, which is very sensitive information about individuals. Is privacy law enough to cope with all this? The GDPR that we all know is a good step, but it's probably not enough in the age we live in. So privacy legislation, human rights law, anti-discrimination laws, are they enough? Consumer law, are they enough to grasp and to really deal with the challenges of algorithmic, for example, decision making? I have my own doubts, especially around anti-discrimination legislation. So we need that fitness test to be performed. And where we identify the gaps, we need to intervene. And that's the first thing. The second thing, in my view, is that we need redress. When somebody is subject to a decision, which is wrong, but that decision is made by a machine, when does the redress happen? Do you know what? With the A-levels fiasco, it was a fiasco, but something did happen because we knew that a decision was made by an algorithm. The problem will happen when public sector, private sector, when they will embed automated decisions without people knowing that a decision has been made by a machine. This is the problem that I see happening, especially around things like predictive policing, things like assignment of housing, those things that can, you know, predictive policing to me is a huge worry, because predictive policing for me is like self-fulfilling prophecies. You know, it's really it's something that we should treat with great care. So the thing is, redress for citizens. So where is the redress going to happen? And then in terms of those algorithms used to make decisions in the most important areas of life: housing, education, and in the justice system. Why don't we have a licensing agency? Why don't we have something that really takes the burden away from the individual and places onto somebody else? Do you know why I think that? Because when we go on the plane, we don't open the engine on a plane to see how it works. We trust that somebody has done the due diligence on the plane, and we trust that somebody has checked that the plane is fit for purpose. Why don't we do the same with those tools that are so important for people's life, because it could change it? If I get or not a housing or not, that changes my life. If I get a loan or not, that changes my life. Those areas, they do require, I think, something stronger: a licensing agency, a trademark, a fairness mark, something I think that reassures people, because what we don't want to do is, I don't want to have the burden to decide if an algorithm is fit for purpose or not. And I'm going to close on this because I think it's really important. One thing that I do not like about the current model of privacy that we have is that we have too many privacy notices and people never read them because they're too complicated. The consent model does not work. What we need in the algorithmic system is exactly the same thing. We need things that when they're so life-changing, when they're so life-impacting, we need somebody to look at these systems before they're rolled out and define whether they are ready or not to be deployed in the public sector and private sector. That's it for me.
Ivana, thank you very much indeed. Before we go to questions, we've got a couple of great questions already. Naureen, over to you.
Hi, Gavin. I was slightly worried that we might be repeating each other on the talk today, but clearly you've really done a great job in putting together a very diverse panel. I think we're all coming at it from very different perspectives. So I would add my thank you for getting us together and for hosting this this important discussion. As I was thinking about the exam question you set us and some of the events that happened over the weekend, so the sad death of Justice Ginsburg, and reflecting on what we're talking about. If you were following social media, there were a lot of quotes that were being circulated, RBG quotes, and one that really struck me, and I'm going to read it out, was, "Women belong in all places where decisions are being made." So here we are today on a panel where the speakers are female and the facilitator is a male. Yay for that. We're clearly in a different chapter to the place where RBG started, and I think we should repurpose that quote, actually, her quote, for our discussion today. And I would say let's use this instead. And I'm going to read this out. Let's think about what can we do to ensure full representation wherever decisions are being made. And what do I mean by full representation? Let's think about the people and the demographic that we're serving, and we need people in the room that are representative. Now, considering how long it's taken us to get to where we've got to with gender equality, and we're by no means there, but considering how long that has taken, It's going to take us a while to get the right people in the right room when it comes to total representation. And I want to give you an example of from the Good Things Foundation. We published a report last week, which I will add to the chat, which is worth reading for anyone with an interest in digital inclusion. Our report showed that 23% of children in the poorest families don't have basic access to the internet or the right sort of devices, so your laptop, desktop, or even a tablet. And this is kind of, if you think about the most vulnerable groups in society, the digital divide is exacerbated. So if you think about unemployed people, disabled people, those with low incomes, they're at the greatest risk of being digitally excluded. And we're all learning all the time about what being excluded means in different ways. The society is changing, so it is an evolving thing. I'm going to close by saying, if we can make this discussion about action, what can we do today? Whilst it would be fantastic if we could be representative tomorrow, but that's not going to happen. We know that history has taught us that. But what can we do? What can we do as take action to move this forward? And really keen to hear what others have to say on that. So I've cut my talk a little shorter, Gavin, because I know you're running over. So I'll pause and hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Naureen. I think that's a great challenge for all of us, actually. And I think a few of the speakers have sort of said that we have been around a lot of these issues for quite some time now. We still keep coming back to the same problems. There's still discussion of the same solutions, but what is the action that's actually required to do something about it? I'm conscious that she is going to have to leave us in the next 10 minutes. So as well as asking the first couple of questions, and thank you for everyone who's submitted questions so far, you can continue to put them on the Q&A. If you've got any other remarks, she also sort of let you make those. So the first two questions that I'll start with, the first is from Emma Booth. And it's a question specifically for Chi, but I think it's something that everyone would be interested in. As an engineer yourself, what should the government be doing to upskill those, often called the neglected middle, to ensure they can continue to upskill in their profession in the context of digitalisation? And I suppose a related question from Charlie. There's a digital divide for older people and disabled people, with unemployment expected to rise further for those two groups due to coronavirus. How can we ensure the digital divide is not preventing older people and disabled people from returning to the labour market? So Chi, maybe if you want to take first go at those.
Thanks very much, Gavin. I can just say those were excellent contributions from everyone, and this has been a really, well-informed, I'd say, and evidence-based debate so far. And those are great. Those are great questions about upskilling and training. And one of the things I find really depressing, if you like, is that before COVID, the digital divide, the 10 million or so who didn't have access, that figure had been around for a while. There wasn't really action, targeted, concentrated, moonshot, mission-led action to address it. So in fact, what in practice, but it's good to be focused on results. So Annalise Dodds this morning was talking about recover, rebuild, retrain. And the fact is that we are going to have increased unemployment. We don't exactly know where, but particularly from the end of the next month, that is going to there's an opportunity there, to ensure that we had to put in place the access to training. Because one of the things that we have stopped doing well, which we did do well sort of in the 60s and 70s, much better, is lifelong learning. And actually lifelong learning where people are. So not lifelong learning that takes place online when you can't get online, but actually lifelong learning sort of in community centres, in where people are and can easily access. And we need to make digital skills, digital training accessible in that way. And the other that takes investment. That takes investment, but people are going to be it's the payback will be huge socially and economically. We have the fourth industrial revolution. We have the climate emergency. All that calls for the kinds of skills that a digital retraining could offer, and particularly actually, as we say, working with unions where people are in work, to support that. But the other thing I'd say is that there are lots of initiatives. Lloyds Bank has an initiative for small small businesses. Barclays has one for the older generation. Google has one for, I think, for younger people. There are lots of initiatives, but the thing is, there's no way of knowing which initiatives you can access. You know, so it's great that there are initiatives, but I think one of the things that government has to do is bring them together and make it easier for people to know what's for them. And finally, one of the things is, you know, this, I saw the question was slightly technical about giving community groups the power of digitalisation. One of the things that I've strongly argued for in the digital government reviews, you know, is that there is an architecture of data which is not about centralisation, you know, which is about, it's a distributed architecture which relies on, you know, standards and trust and governance to ensure appropriate exchange of appropriate data. But that is, you know, we're talking about building a national data infrastructure. That's something that the department has announced. That is the kind of architecture it should be, and so communities retain sort of the data and the control over their data, but we still have appropriate data sharing, and that can drive community empowerment. So that's what I'll say.
Fantastic, Chi. Thank you. Perhaps if we go around the panel in the same order that I introduced them, so I'll go to Tracy next. And just to say, as Chi mentioned, there is another question now as well, which you may also want to answer, which is the panel's spoken about data, its use and protection, but how do we give community groups the power of digitalisation without exposing them to data capture that might alienate community empowerment models?
Well, I think it's one word for me, it's trust, isn't it? And to get to that position, there's a lot more that a lot of people could be doing. I think people need to understand that if we're all trying to achieve a common goal that's actually going to help them in the end, and people can explain how and why and what's going to happen, they inherently have more trust. I think we've seen, haven't we, in the handling more generally of the COVID crisis, how, you know, at the start, people were very, very good about following the things, keeping the message simple and I think that's the same on digital. We need to sort of deal with the fear factor, and we need to do that by being honest with people. Nothing is ever an absolute panacea for everybody, as I touched on in my little opener. You know, yes, it's one thing to upskill people, but there's still maybe a cost of going digital that not everybody can meet. And there may be stuff that can be done there on a community level. I am old-fashioned in thinking that actually, if we did deliver services in ways that actually are what the public want, you would find a much better respect for the public service more generally, and you'd see a lot less of the chipping away of it. And actually, one of the really important things you could do with digital, a bit like how we've rolled out broadband and stuff, is actually start listening to the users and thinking about what kind of training would really help them, how that will build that kind of trust. We, as a regulator, I've got a very, very particular regulated community in mind, but everything we do in law tech and legal services is also about the ultimate end user, the customer, the consumer, the citizen. And I think those words need to just be much more attached to some of the stuff. It's not just about X amount of money from government or a grant for this, it's what actually happens. And let's evaluate what's working, and let's share, in another phrase that people will cringe, I'm sure, but let's be truly open source. Let's talk about what does and what doesn't work. And then the points that Ivana was touching on about what kind of regulations you need and what kind of data is subject to being checked and what's on a register. Some of that would fall away because actually people would know how they could access some of these things anyway. So, you know, I don't think it's simple, but I definitely think with a bit more of a common purpose, we could achieve a bit more.
Thanks, Tracy. Ivana.
I mean, that's a very, very good question, and there is a problem. In fact, one of the things that I actually worry a lot about when it comes to the use of AI in the first place is very much around this automation of these issues. You know, the problem is that, you know, we are going to automate these issues around inequality, but also the calls that some make around, you know, how all these processes have to be transparent. Yes, they have to be transparent, and transparency is the most important thing. And I totally agree with this, which is very different from some others people with, you know, some others calling for example, this panacea of explainability in algorithms, you know, which is well, it's okay, but I do think it's going to fail with exactly the people who need that transparency the most, because it's very complicated to for example, understand how the system works. And I would like the burden of the responsibility around the transparency and the to be placed onto the organizations actually using these systems. Otherwise, I think that the risk that we're going to run into is really fail those who would need that transparency, the most. In terms of data, now, I think that the crisis that we've seen, not just in the UK, but across the world, actually, in terms of the leveraging of data for the common good during COVID, has been very much a crisis of infrastructure around data. And I do think that that we need to identify new ways to harness the value of data that we've got. And this comes in two different ways. The first one is through different infrastructures. So I'm thinking, for example, of things around data trust, things around data trust. I'm thinking about things like data cooperatives. I'm thinking about new structures that could, new social contract around the use of data that people can stipulate with an intermediary, with a third party, and some of contractual arrangement between us and a body using their data. And this is really, really important, because we need to worry about misuse of data, but we also need to worry about misuse of data, and we don't really want to miss the opportunities the data gives us. That's the first thing. The second thing that I think is really, really important is to revisit the concept of privacy in itself. You know, people have, you know, we can't, privacy is an evolving concept. I've been in privacy law for a long, long time, but privacy changes. If I get used to unlock my phone using my face, there is no doubt that the concept of privacy and the way that people view privacy evolves with technology. There's absolutely no doubt about it. And and so I think, you know, we need to say, is privacy the same concept that we had 20, 30, 40 years ago, or has it changed? For me, you know, when I say to people that I'm in privacy law, people immediately say, oh gosh, you must be so worried about your personal information, where it goes. And I say, frankly, not really. You know, what I'm worried about is idea of privacy as a collective value, and not much into as a purely personal individual thing. The last thing I wanted to say is the role of privacy enhancing technologies. There is, when I hear the dichotomy between here's privacy, here's the security, here is privacy, here is public health. No, we don't need to have that dilemma. There is no dilemma, because we can have both. We are at the level right now where we can have the use of synthetic data, we can use differential privacy. We have the privacy enhancing technologies to really make the most of the data that we have. The problem is that they're still very expensive to use this tech. So I would want to see massive government investment in privacy enhancing tech. That would mean creating trust, and at the same time, really allowing people to be able to use technology and data as much as possible.
Excellent. Thank you, Ivana. Naureen.
I want to take it back to people, and the topic of our discussion, which is around, we talk about digital exclusion. Let's talk about digital inclusion. I think there was a question around older people and digital exclusion, but the pandemic showed us actually older people, but also younger people were impacted. And actually, the overriding theme is the most vulnerable. I'm going to sound like a broken record, but it was the most vulnerable. The socioeconomic background was the biggest determinant in terms of seeing who was worst impacted. There is existing infrastructure, and there are very active community groups at grassroots level who are working on this issue. What's needed is investment. The Good Things Foundation being one of them. We have a network of online centres across the country, not just in London, but there are also other organisations. So these organisations exist. They have been activated during coronavirus, but there is an investment issue. When we're thinking about investing in broadband, let's also think about those who don't have access to broadband. When we're thinking about, I don't use my inclusive minutes every month. So what's happening to the excess of that? Is there a way we can donate that? There are ways we can think more creatively. So I think that's I guess what I'm saying is, look, the infrastructure's there, we need investment. The organisations are there, we need investment. And actually, some of this is kind of, let's go back to old school methods. Face-to-face is still really important. So actually, even when you're giving somebody a device, they might not know how to use it. And I think it was Tracy who talked about devices as well as having the right skills. And also that who would you want to show you how to use that device? Somebody like you. So for me, it would be somebody like me. It would be the equivalent of a Bangladeshi Muslim woman, for example, and there are many others. So I kind of, I just think to get the investment, we don't need to reinvent the wheel. The second point is around when we think about economic growth, we need to think about digital inclusion as part of economic growth. This isn't a nice thing to do. It's not a nice thing to have. If we're going to be we're on that journey. If we want to be a global player in terms of the digital economy, in terms of digital government, we need to tackle digital inclusion. So there's one aspect of it, which is how do we ensure we give those people who don't have the basic devices, give them the tools for that. But there's the other aspect of how do we retrain our workforce so they do have those digital skills. That will add to UK PLC and our economic growth. So I mean, I guess it's just, let's not make it a nice thing to have. It's got to be part of the future, the vision. We're working on a digital strategy at the moment, the government is, and I see that she has a review as well. But we need all parties to look at this, not as a paragraph at the end on digital exclusion with the most vulnerable groups, but let's integrate it.
Thank you very much indeed. So we've got about 10 minutes left, so there is still an opportunity for some final questions if anybody wants to add them to the Q&A. In the meantime, and I'll reverse the order this time, so I'll go to Naureen first. A couple more questions, one which follows on perfectly, I think, from that. This is from James Findlay. Is access to the internet a human right? How can the state and industry support access to the internet and digital tools through investment, innovation, policy and regulation? So that's one question. And another one, just sort of given to me beforehand, when we think about the so-called digital divide, and again this is something that a few of you have covered, what might be the unintended consequences of wholly digital services or public policy sort of being delivered digitally? So Naureen, I'll go to you first.
Wow, that's a great question. Is it a basic human right? Well, I think if you look at the Maslow hierarchy of needs, right, we've seen those socializing on social media, but we would rejig that, right, and we would have access to the internet as right up there. So I think it is obviously, clearly we've discussed at length how our regulations and our policy and our legislative framework needs to be updated to reflect that. What can we all be doing? Well, if you're from the private sector, get behind devices.now, and that's a coalition of industry, of private sector companies who you can donate devices, but also support programs which address the skills gap. So that's just something that we can all get behind. Thinking about coming from a private sector organisation, think about your CSR programs, and are you using those CSR programs and channeling them to address some of the gaps that we've talked about. And the second question was, Gavin?
So the second question was sort of unintended consequences of going to wholly digital delivery of public services and policy.
Well, I would go back to where I started, which is who are the people in the room who are making those decisions right now? And we've seen the impact of that during coronavirus. We've seen certain communities being disproportionately impacted, and that is the cost, and that is the intended consequences, however you look at it. It's we've got to have the right people in the right room. Who are you all representing? Excellent,
thank you. Ivana, next.
I couldn't agree more. I think yes, I mean, we've seen it with COVID. We see with the contact tracing app, when everything seemed to be sort of based on when the technology, for example, instead of being a tool supporting as part of a wider strategy, for like about a month, everything was focused on, oh, we need the app. In reality, the app works if it's part of a wider strategy. So I would go back to this issue of techno-chauvinism, which is the idea that everything has to be delivered from a technological standpoint, which is that true? Is that real? And again, I would look at what is the way, how, in which we make decisions around whether or not to deploy a particular piece of technology. And again, I always think, are we able to evaluate the unintended consequence of a product we put out there? If we decide to offer a particular service only in a specific way, are we evaluating what the unintended consequences are on people, communities? And it's not necessarily that because something is technological or digitally done, that it's not automatic that the benefit need to outweigh the risks. And to me, it's always a matter of decision-making process. And over the last few years, what we've seen is some technology being deployed not because we needed to do so, no, because we had something in mind, which was, I want to reach this, and this is the goal that I have for the common good, and this is the technology that I'm deploying to support it. It's been the other way around. It's been not us driving the technology, driving the digital transformation, but it's been us having to adapt to a digital transformation, a technological transformation, that rather than being in charge, it's humans being in charge and say, this is the timetable, this is decision making underpinning what I'm doing. And to me, this is where sort of the worry comes. Now, I'm a big fan of digitization. Of course I am. I really do like it. But I think we can't just do things without looking at the wider picture, without understanding the risks. Obviously, if the people making decisions come from a specific background only, and they do not represent the variety of people out there in society, then we're not going to know how the particular project or digitization or new technology that we're going to use is going to really work on for the people who are going to be impacted the most. So it is a matter, I think, of adopting a wider framework, especially in public sector, around assessment of the projects that we are going to embark on.
Thank you. Tracy.
Yep, I very much agree with fellow panelists. I think I would say access to internet is not so much a human right, it's a need, and a basic need that needs absolutely fulfilling with fairness and proportionality. And I think that what we've seen about the rollout broadband, the fact there are whole areas of the country that still don't have access, and that's really been brought out. We also need to just plan, and we need to be able to execute a plan well. As we've seen with lots of things, there's often a lot of hype. I think this is it's a human right we can meet. It's a basic need now, and more so than ever, if people are not going to be going back into workplaces, we'll have even more problems down the line if you cannot be enabled to work from home in a way that may even hold you back from getting a job, from taking it up. That would be something would be completely unacceptable. So I think we need to look at all of these studies that are emerging now about how the world of work, our expectations of how we live are changing, and make sure that access to good technology is workable. It'd be awful to get all the cultural shift done and then fail at the hurdle of technical execution. So as I say, I think it's a basic fairness thing now, and if we don't address it, we'll all regret it. On the second question, unintended consequences, this is a thing I wrestle with all the time. Because of my background as a civil servant, I'm a natural on the one hand, on the other. What's the objective answer? What are the pros and cons? And I absolutely think we've got to just be mindful of developing this with real people in mind, understanding which sectors lend themselves best to completely digitized services, which don't. I definitely think some people now will never go back to shopping in quite the same way. So, we've seen internet service provision on supermarket delivery go through the roof, but there's always going to be groupthink. And you just have to be mindful of that. And I think particularly in technology space, just check out your assumptions. And very much with what Ivana said is, it's a good thing, but it's only a good thing if it's executed properly, and just have that in mind at all times. And very much agree also on the diversity point. It's about who is helping you, who do you trust, who's going to teach you, how do we get everybody to the same base levels rather than some people racing ahead and some people lagging behind. Let's try and get it leveled up, to coin a phrase, and get people all moving forward at the same rate. They're my observations.
Fantastic, Tracy, thank you. We are nearly very much at time, but I'm going to squeeze in one final question. If you could answer in just a couple of sentences each, and I'll go to Tracy, then Ivana, then to Naureen. What do you think success looks like for all of this? What would you like to see from government? How will you measure whether things have got better?
I think three things for me. I think a little bit of understanding that it's going to be a patchy journey. You can't just sort of tell people that they're lagging behind, or they're, not being a zealot is not a bad thing per se. Try and personalise what might seem a quite impersonal kind of public service. That's the thing about digital, faceless, all the rest of it. And just acknowledge that even if you don't all start in the same place, you can all get to the finish line together. And that's what good execution of government policy on tech and digital would look like for me.
Brilliant, thank you. Ivana?
So success to me would look like three things. First is really be very realistic and pragmatic around what legislation we need, and if we need, what regulation we need, and to really assess what we've got in place right now. And we haven't done that yet. We haven't done an assessment of current legislation in terms of. The second thing that would be really important success would be to listen to researchers. Listen to social practitioners, and not just to tech firms. And it's really important to do that, because we really need to listen to people who are the front line of this. They know and they understand the long-term consequences of the product that they create. And the third thing is to really involve people in these discussions. This is our technological future. This is our digital future, in a space where we navigate in and out digital space all the time, where there's really little distinction between the digital and the physical space. This is about everybody, and it's really important that we discuss it together.
Brilliant, thank you. And finally, Naureen.
So I'd say two things. First of all, let's make sure those in influence and positions of power, and those that influence those people in positions of power, are representative. Secondly, I would say, what's the measure of success? We've got a digital strategy, which I think will be published at some point in the near future. Let's make sure some of the points we discussed there are reflected in that, but not just an articulation of the problems and the state of the world. I think we've got that today. We know what the big issues are, but with action and with the right investment in the right areas to solve. I think it's as simple as that. She says.
Simple is one word, certainly.
That's one way to say it.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much indeed. So that's it for this event. But please do tune into the Institute for Government's other virtual Fringe events today. At 3:30, Lisa Nandy and others will be discussing Britain's role in the world after Brexit. And at 5:30, David Lammy will be one of the panellists at our final event of the day on learning lessons before launching an inquiry. And do join us in a couple of weeks' time for our events at the Conservative Conference Fringe, including one with the Solicitors Regulation Authority on a very similar topic, harnessing technology, transforming services and making the most of the digital revolution. All that remains for me to say are some very big thank yous. First to all of you for joining us. Excellent questions. Second, to the Solicitors Regulation Authority for supporting the event. And finally, do join me in a virtual round of applause for our fantastic speakers today. A huge thank you to them. So many topics covered. We could have kept going all afternoon, I think. So hopefully see you at one of our other events later. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon, and thank you very much indeed.